Hi, I'm Shan Wu with the Undercolor of Law analysis of the Hunter Biden Special Counsel report that was just released. We've all been waiting for the Jack Smith one, which has been totally mired in Judge Eileen Cannon's mischief. But we do now have the released Hunter Biden Special Counsel report from the Special Counsel David Weiss, who has spent the better part of a decade investigating and prosecuting this case. The report itself is really a little bit eyebrow-raising, not for anything substantive that's contained in it. It's actually relatively non-substantive, but for how defensive it really is. Weiss is really personally offended by President Biden having pardoned Hunter Biden, his son. So we might want to just recall briefly, Weiss first began this investigation when he was still a mere U.S. attorney for Delaware during the Trump 1 DOJ. When that administration concluded, the Biden administration and Attorney General Merrick Garland made the unusual decision of keeping Weiss on rather than appointing a new U.S. attorney, which is typically what happens. So U.S. attorneys are like the federal version of the DA in their jurisdictions. There are 93 of them, corresponding to 94 judicial districts. Guam and the Northern Marianas share one, that's why it's 93. And the districts correspond to the federal district court jurisdictions. So in a larger state like New York, you might see a northern district, southern district, even an eastern and western district. In each of those, they will have their own U.S. attorney. In a place like Delaware, though, there's only one U.S. attorney. And take a look at just how it's spread across the United States. If you need to find your local U.S. attorney, you can go to this link and look for them. The U.S. attorneys appoint assistant U.S. attorneys, people like me, and they are the people who go to court every day and prosecute the cases. But in a smaller place like Delaware, there's only one U.S. attorney. He'll have a big staff of assistant U.S. attorneys, but typically he would have left. The United States attorneys usually submit their resignations, or they're kind of like asked to go, so that the incoming president, this is a presidential appointment position, can install their own U.S. attorneys. Biden didn't do that. He kept Weiss on, which I think showed that Biden was not going to interfere in any way with the investigation of his son. So Weiss continued to investigate. Eventually, he reached a plea deal with Hunter Biden, which, as you may recall, crashed and burned over what I think was really incompetence on Weiss's part over the scope of the deal. Now, I've said this before, but what happens in those kinds of cases is if the plea deal falls apart, you go back to the office, get chewed out, and then work the problem to make the plea go through. The only time the pleas really go south and can't be salvaged is if the defendant is saying, oh, I can't admit to this crime. That was not the case with Hunter Biden. Actually, what the issue was that Weiss refused to concede as part of the plea that Biden might not be prosecuted for other crimes besides the tax evasion and the false statement about the gun form, which he falsely represented he was not a drug user or an addict at that time. Now, no defense counsel would have agreed to that because what's the point? You're pleading your client out, and yet he still might be prosecuted for other stuff you don't know about yet. So that plea deal fell apart. Garland, Attorney General Garland, did not step in here. He could have. Weiss was directly under his control, his supervision at that time. Instead, as a storm of political criticism arose from the right, saying Biden was getting a sweetheart deal, and Weiss was failing to actually bring Biden, the President Biden, to justice, Garland instead decided to elevate Weiss to special counsel status. Now, I was highly critical of that when it happened, as you can see from the article that I wrote, the opinion piece. Now, ostensibly, this could have been justified under the idea that Weiss needed to pursue cases now in both California, the tax case, and Delaware, the gun case. That was one of the reasons given for changing his status to special counsel. But actually, that makes very little sense because U.S. attorneys can be allowed to go outside their jurisdiction if the Attorney General gives them that permission. After all, the Justice Department has national jurisdiction. Now, we can infer why Garland did this, right? I mean, the special counsel does actually get more independence, a little bit more in fact. DOJ is not involved in the daily supervision, although they still need to follow the DOJ regs. But the special counsel certainly gets more independence in the eyes of the public because they look like they're a separate entity from DOJ. Maybe Garland wanted no part of supervising this case. So that gets us to not one but two trials where it's widely agreed that trials are unusual because the gun charge never gets brought unless the gun's used in the crime. It wasn't. And tax criminal charges are rare where taxes are paid, albeit paid late. So we get guilty convictions in both cases. One goes all the way through trial. The other, Hunter takes the unusual step of just pleading straight up with no deal, throwing himself in the mercy of the court. And then President Biden pardons Hunter. Cue the howls of outrage from the extreme right, who seem perfectly fine with the idea that a president has immunity to where they could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, but they find it outrageous that President Biden pardons his son. Hardly the first president, as we've discussed before, to do so, meaning pardoning a family member. Jimmy Carter pardoned his brother, and I'll spare you all the other examples, but my favorite one is President Lincoln, who pardoned his wife. So the pardon is then explained by Biden, and he didn't have to do that. But he did explain his reasons for doing that, and then cue the further outrage. You can take a listen here.
If Biden actually believed that his son was politicized by the Justice Department's prosecution, then why has he not fired one employee of the Justice Department? Because if he believes that there's corruption, if he believes that they're unfairly targeting individuals, he has the authority to fire those prosecutors, yet he hasn't done that.
Congressman Jason Smith, who led one of the Republican investigations into Hunter Biden, reacting to President Biden's reversal and pardoning his son.
So, right, the congressman is seriously suggesting that Biden should have fired DOJ employees like Weiss rather than letting them do the process, the investigation, prosecution, and then pardoning his son. That's laughable logic. I mean, what if Biden had given no reasons? Would the congressman then say it would have been fine because he's just exercising his pardon power? I think not. I think the congressman probably would have found something to complain about or to say anyway. Now let's take a listen to this analysis by a former federal prosecutor, actually.
And usually, Sandra, the scandalous pardons happen when a failed president is on his way out the door. These pardons happened early because they didn't want Hunter to get sentenced and have the judgment of conviction entered, which is what would have started to happen next week.
Okay, so what's silly here is how he describes scandalous pardons as only happening at the end of a failed presidency. Okay, so failed presidencies like Trump's first term, where he pardoned his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, his former national security advisor, Mike Flynn, his strategist, Steve Bannon, and on his last full day in office, Trump pardoned 143 people. Right, so I suppose that must seem to this former prosecutor like quite a failed presidency, according to that guy on Fox. Now, turning to the report itself. Weiss's report is only 27 pages long. Easy enough to read through it, and we'll put up the link for you to take a look at it. Here's a screenshot of the cover. And what's notably absent from his report is he really avoids talking about the over half decade he spent investigating crimes that occurred as far back as 2016. 2016 through 2019 was the period that Hunter Biden did not pay his taxes. And the gun charge arose in 2018. That's where he falsely says he's not using drugs or is not a drug addict. If you look through this report, I mean, there's some appendices to it, a lot of appendices to it, but you're not going to see in the main part of the report, or even really much in the appendices, anything that points out just how long this investigation had been going on for. And there's also little or no detail about all the dead ends he must have ran into about the so-called Biden influence peddling, or that President Biden was involved in Hunter's business propositions, which the extreme right continues to push now, probably because there was no evidence of that. Now, instead of talking about that, the fact that this is what we found, and what we found didn't have anything to do with President Biden, he's rather silent on that part. Now, he has an excuse for that, and as part of that excuse, he manages to work in a little bit of a potential dig at Biden, because he says, Weiss does, that because of the pardon that Biden gave, that he, Weiss, cannot talk about or refer to any uncharged third parties. So you can be sure that the extreme right is going to make a lot out of that, saying, oh, the pardon was actually calculated to shield anything coming out in the special counsel's report about all these supposedly influence peddling allegations that were totally nonsensical and there's no evidence for. Oh, but by doing this pardon, it wasn't just to protect his son, it was actually to shield himself because Weiss wouldn't be able to put anything in the special report about it. Now, Weiss spends a lot of time bragging about his experience as a career investigator and prosecutor, and one of the things he really takes exception to is Biden's criticism of him, really, saying that he had to spare Hunter from being further persecuted by the next department. I don't imagine Trump would have fired Weiss. He would have kept him on ad infinitum trying to investigate Hunter Biden. And so he's very offended by that. He's saying that President Biden is smearing the entire Justice Department. I mean, I can see how he says it on paper. I mean, I really think it's more of a smear perhaps directed at Weiss. But more importantly, that kind of diatribe by Weiss has no place in the special counsel report. Because the point of the special counsel report is it's meant to tell the U.S. public what was done and the reasons for doing that. And that's very poorly laid out here. The purpose of the report is not to fire back and criticize the president. You weren't investigating the president. You didn't find anything to investigate there. That's not the place to be criticizing whatever the president did in his pardon. It's not a special report about a pardon. It's a special report about a half-decade-long investigation that resulted in convictions. That's what it's about, not about a pardon. So Garland could have weighed in here, but just as he did with the Hur report, where he allowed her to smear Biden's mental fitness, Garland allows Weiss to go forward with this innuendo intact that maybe Weiss can't reveal, and maybe just what he might reveal might have still implicated Garland. So again, watch for that nonsense to be coming out. And maybe, just maybe, Garland is letting Weiss defend DOJ's performance in the face of Biden's criticism of the prosecution against his son, when the real person who should step forward and defend what's happened there is Attorney General Garland. All right, that's it for now. Good talking to you again. And please keep those comments and replies coming. They're really great to read, even if I can't get back to all of you on those. And we do take them into account, so let us hear what you think. Thanks.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.